Hello, everyone. Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us today for the Future of Shopping Centers in a Post-Pandemic World AMA Live. My name is Riley Stevens. I'm the Director of Insights here at Retail Profit, and I will be your moderator for today's event. As always, I wanted to go through a few housekeeping items before we get started. We've allocated an hour for this chat, and we'll be wrapping everything up by 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The chat box has been disabled. This also includes things like raising your hand, so just be mindful of this for the next hour. If you do have a question, feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen there. We encourage you to post and share your thoughts using the hashtag #RetailProfitAMA. And now for introductions. Doug Stevens is the founder and CEO of Retail Profit. As I mentioned, he's currently writing his third and highly anticipated book, Resurrecting Retail, The Future of Business in a Post-Pandemic World. Now, this book is going to be released early spring 2021, and the insights that Doug will be sharing today are based on the extensive research that he has done to date for the book. And now for our very special guest, Mark Toro. Mark Toro is joining us today, and we are so excited to be having him here. Before co-founding North American Properties Atlanta in 1996, Mark Toro served in several leadership positions. He has acquired, developed, or redeveloped more than 70 projects totaling 30 million square feet. Mark's passion lies in creating smarter built environments and healthier, happier places. He believes a thoughtfully designed place fosters a higher quality of life for its users. Whether through his relentless advocating for expanded transit and walkability, lending his expertise to rebuild one of Atlanta's most impoverished neighborhoods, or developing award-winning mixed-use communities, Mark is constantly reimagining place by focusing on the street-level energy and human experience. With the recent repositioning of Atlanta's Atlantic Station, or the development of Alpharetta's $1 billion Avalon project and redevelopment of Colony Square, Mark continues to fearlessly lead the North American Properties team through uncharted waters, where together they are developing a new generation of experience-driven commercial real estate. Mark also currently chairs Midtown Alliance's board of directors and serves on the boards of Woodruff Art Center, City of Refuge, and the ATL, a newly formed authority governing public transportation in the Atlanta region. He was also recently elected to the Board of Trustees of ICSC, bringing 30 years of retail development experience to the International Retail Industry Group. And if you weren't already impressed by Mark's outstanding bio, Mark has also been named one of 55 most influential Atlantans by Atlanta Magazine, recognized as one of the most admired CEOs by the Atlanta Business Chronicle, presented with the Henry H. Robinson Award by Atlanta Commercial Board of Realtors, and honored by the Hispanic American Business Leadership Association as Entrepreneur of the Year and named Citizen of the Year by Greater North Fulton Chamber of Commerce. So you can see now why we are so incredibly thrilled to have Mark join us today. I'm going to jump right in because I know we only have an hour. Mark, for those in the audience who don't know your work or aren't as familiar with your work, can you describe the unique approach that you and your team are taking to develop a site, say for Avalon, for instance?
Well, first of all, thank you, Doug and Riley, for having me. And thank you for that flowery bio. I guess it proves that you hang around long enough, stuff starts to pile up. But I think to sum up what we do in one phrase is that we build community. We don't build buildings. We actually characterize our company in three versions, right? 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. 1.0 being that point in time, that era where we developed shopping centers and we built ground up, target anchored power centers all over the Southeast. 2.0, when we conceived the idea that mixed use was the next generation of commercial real estate, and that's when we made the revelation, when we discovered, essentially by observing our properties in operation, that it was about community, not about the buildings. And the space between the buildings was as important as those buildings that houses uses like hotels and office buildings and office tenants and apartment residents. And then 3.0 is essentially our look at acquiring properties that have characteristics, have the bones, but have yet to have the idea of community injected into them. So when we developed Avalon, we built community before we built community, going to where our prospective guests live online, right? So we built an army of advocates and owners by enlisting them in the development and curating process. Then we constructed the property, right? So we actually do build buildings and building community. But the key component now, we started Avalon and we acquired the land in June of 11. We broke ground in January of 13. We delivered the first phase in October of 14, second phase in April of 17, hotel in January of 18, the last office building just in January of this year. So it's almost a decade in formation of this city within a city. But the key component today, and since opening, since first phase grand opening, is operations. You would characterize it as operations. We call it experience making. So it's all of the soft touch, service, hospitality, social media, valet, concierge, music, lighting, all the things that make an experience and make our guest feel something. It is the same kind of business that a great restaurateur or hotelier is in, assuring that when the guest arrives on the property, their arrival experience causes them to emote positively, right? So they're happy, they're warm, we often talk about it in terms of love, right? There are people who say that Avalon makes them feel like a European city. It feels like living on vacation. It feels like a cruise ship. But all of those pieces of that puzzle are more about hospitality and service, or even to take it to the next step, about entertainment than about real estate. So, and the overarching theme in all that is knitting together humans to interact. Now we're going to talk about the impacts of COVID, and specifically at our properties, but that's the differentiator, is that it's about community.
Now, there's simply no way to sugarcoat it. You touched on it. We're going to get to the conversation about COVID, but I read an interesting statistic not too long ago that suggested that by the end of this year, 50 to 60 American mall tenants could be closed or bankrupt. So many believe that we haven't even really yet seen the extent of the carnage and the fallout from the pandemic. Mark, in your opinion, do you believe that we are approaching or in the midst of a commercial real estate crisis in the US? And if so, who do you see as being the winners and losers in this space?
We are, without question, in the early innings of a crisis. The distress is just now being felt. You can see it in virtually every food group, with the exception of industrial, which is actually prospering because of the fulfillment requirements of e-commerce. But the multifamily residential is starting to see cracks in the dam by virtue of the high unemployment and the inability for people to pay rent. Office tenants are starting to rethink their requirements, both in scale and in term. Significant CBDs and large high-rise office buildings will be impacted. Retail was already in a tailspin. And the retailers that were becoming less relevant, that were unable to play omni-channel, that didn't understand that someone had moved their cheese, and were still doing what they did, were not long for this world anyway. And we call the pandemic the great accelerator, especially with respect to retailers. I read recently that I think there are 23 significant bankruptcy filings up to the end of July. There have probably been one or two in August already. And that is, I think, eclipses the number for all of last year and is only, we are on pace to exceed the bankruptcy filings for 2008, 2009. What that will do is allow many of these retailers to reject leases that were underperforming. It will allow them to get out from under massive debt that many of them took on, but it still may not be enough for them to shake the fact that they are no longer relevant to the American consumer. Regardless of whether or not their debt structure and their cost of occupancy and all of the financial parameters are a challenge to their business model, if what they're selling people aren't buying, they're out of business. And there are dozens of those retailers. So then you go one step up the food chain to the landlord, and then beyond them to the lender. And we have an unraveling of the income stream, the net operating income for these properties. Rents will continue to see pressure. I mean, I've been reading about New York City, Midtown Manhattan rents already seeing significant downward pressure. There's a one block on there are, I want to say, 3 storefronts on Madison Avenue. It's the first block to trade on Madison Avenue in like 30 years. And the price discovery on that is leading us to believe that the valuation is now being impacted by the decrease in rents. So the trickle down effect of retailers not performing, not being able to pay rent, landlords not being able to pay their debt service. I read this morning that CBL's market cap is $34 million. They own 108 properties. That $34 million couldn't have bought one of those 108 properties 10 years ago. In 2007, their market cap was $3.3 billion. So they've lost 99% of their value. They are the first casualty in the mall REIT space, but they will absolutely not be the last. There is carnage coming in the mall REIT space. The fact, however, is that yields opportunity. Let's never let a crisis go to waste, right? And I believe that because those malls were and are located on great real estate, with the demise of the department stores that typically had their hooks in a lot of the operations of those malls, we should be able to see redevelopment opportunities to be more responsive to the market than the typical B and C enclosed regional mall.
Hey, Mark, we've seen recently organizations like Simon, for example, reaching out and making overtures to certain retailers. Brooks Brothers comes to mind here, whether loaning money to brands or in some cases becoming an investor in those brands. Do you see that? I mean, maybe you can just explain what the end game is there, and if you see, is that a viable strategy to weather the storm, or is it just forestalling the inevitable?
My knee-jerk reaction, uneducated about the economics, because that's likely what's driving this. I mean, yeah. Brooks Brothers Simon may have so much exposure to Brooks Brothers in their malls that it's better to own them, to prop up the co-tenancy within that mall, to be able to not unravel all the rental, the whole concept of, let me explain co-tenancy for those who may not be familiar. Often in regional malls and lots of shopping centers, retailers have a provision in their lease that allows them to not pay rent if the occupancy within a certain market sector. So if let's say you're Brooks Brothers, you may require that 70% of all of the apparel retailers in that mall be open and operating in order for you to have to pay rent. So what starts to happen is you lose 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, and you trip the co-tenancy, and then everybody's out. That may be a strategy for these mall owners that have lots of exposure to large fashion retailers to start to string together a group of tenants that they can control and own and continue to be open and occupied, so that they don't trip the co-tenancy. My gut is they're rearranging chairs on the Titanic.
Hmm.
It is, Brooks Brothers was one of those brands that was becoming less relevant. When was the last time you put on a tie? I mean, I can't imagine. There's going to be a time at some point where we're going to put a tie on and a suit and go back to maybe for a wedding or a funeral.
I was just going to say weddings and funerals. Yeah.
Exactly. You know what? I went to a wedding last Saturday night and I didn't even wear a coat. I mean, it was outdoors and it was very casual. And I think it is foolhardy for there's kind of chasing their tail in buying these retailers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was my sense too. Stopgap measure just to keep the sky from falling, more or less. But it doesn't, as you point out, it doesn't change the irrelevance of certain brands. It doesn't make them more relevant just because they're funded.
Right.
Now, there's a lot of changes that are happening, and we mentioned just wearing a tie as being one change, but there's some bigger changes happening too, which are leading people to make different choices in their life, one of which being potentially moving out of cities. So this is something that, Doug, I know you've written a piece on recently, and Mark, we've discussed at length. Now, there's this belief, obviously, and growing evidence about this migration out of urban centers as companies give staff the freedom to work remotely. How is this going to impact the industry? Maybe, Doug, do you want to kick off? And then Mark, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've all heard this said before, I think, that cities are an enduring aspect of humanity, at least for thousands of years they have been. Most recently, our current version of cities, I guess, is really a product of the Industrial Revolution. And in a relatively short period of time, we went from being 80% agrarian and rural to becoming 80% urbanized. And so there are those people that point to the fact that, people are always going to be attracted to cities, the energy of a city, the variety of lifestyle in cities. And I think that has been true up until now, but partly because we never had a choice. We never really had a viable alternative to being in a city if that in fact was where you worked. And now, I mean, just by virtue of the tools we're using today, it's very clear that communication and work and the nature of that has been fundamentally changed by technology. So just to put a point on it, there was a survey done recently among technology workers in the San Francisco Bay Area, and it was a robust survey. It was very credible. And they determined that 66% of technology workers in the Bay Area, if given the choice to live elsewhere, would indeed move out of the Bay Area. Now, where is debatable. Some might move, within 10 miles of the Bay Area. Other people might move to the mountains of Colorado. Who knows? But the fact of the matter is, if those people leave the Bay Area, what does that do to the Bay Area? Well, there's also a significant study that suggests that every technology worker in the Bay Area supports 6 service workers in the Bay Area. So bartenders, restaurant servers, service workers, retail workers. And so that puts a massive dent in the economy. So you have, on the one hand, you have this migration of people, potential migration of people outside of cities, which obviously is going to have an impact on the retail scene in those cities. The other aspect is the fact that as that impact takes place and small restaurants and shops and the things that make a city interesting begin to close down, and people feel the smallness of their living situation now because the city can't be their backyard the way it once was, you really have people debating, is this where I want to be? It's costly. My lifestyle is impeded somewhat. Is this where I want to be? And so I think that we are potentially going to see not a wholesale exodus, not necessarily, everybody en masse leaving, but it doesn't take everybody to leave a city to change the character of the city. And I feel pretty comfortable that if Google, Twitter, Facebook, Salesforce and companies like that employ thousands of people. If they give them the freedom to leave, I think a significant percentage of them will.
I think you're spot on, Doug. And I think that all of us, beyond what we read, form our opinions based on our personal perspective and our life and our lifestyle and the lifestyle of our friends and loved ones. I happen to reside in Midtown Atlanta, in the only really urban district in a city of 6 million people. It's very transit rich. It's very tech oriented. It's very densely populated. I live in a high rise on the 35th floor, a block from my office, where I office on the 16th floor. The driving force post recession for Midtown Atlanta has been tech employment. Microsoft and Google have significant, I'm probably between them, 4,000 jobs under office space for 4,000 employees under construction. There have been something on north of 20,000 jobs announced in the last 18 months. Many of them are already seated, but they're not seated. They're living at home. Many of those employers have driven the development of high-rise residential in Midtown. There's a 4-story Whole Foods Market a block from my home that wasn't there a year ago. So as you point out, Doug, for those of us who live in cities, the city is no longer serving as our backyard. Notwithstanding the fact that Piedmont Park is still Atlanta Central Park, we don't have the High Museum of Art. We don't have the Fox Theater. We don't have the restaurants and bars and nightclubs and things that form an urban life. So consequently, in mid-March, my wife and I retreated to our home in the mountains of Western North Carolina, which is in a town of 600 people, maybe. And it's extraordinarily ex-urban. We do have a grocery store within 10 miles or so, but that's about all the excitement we can muster. We go back every few weeks, and notwithstanding the fact that the city is dormant for the most part, even during the day, because most people are not coming to the office, we still have an affinity for it. And I think that will return. We will, when I grew up in an ex-urban small town in New Jersey like this, where I am now, and my daughters were raised in the classic American suburb called East Cobb in Atlanta. And when we started considering an urban life, I remember saying to my wife one day, if we stay here, I'm going to rot on this couch. And the energy, the diversity of experience, the mobility, the excitement of a city. We grew up in the New York metro area, so New York City was always an appealing kind of lifestyle. And we gravitated toward it, and then moved into the city, moved into a high rise, and have never looked back until now. And I'm seeing not only in my household, but in my daughter's households, they're now considering things like social unrest, quality of schools, congestion, the things that formed the mass exodus from the cities in the 60s and 70s that now gave rise to our current existence, our suburbs today, right? So I think the jury's out. The city's not going to die. The city will still be attractive to the millennial. Riley, I know you live in Toronto, right? So do you plan to leave the city?
It's again, like this whole experience has been a really interesting turning point where I've started to question for the first time if this is the long-term plan. Now, for me as well, having grown up in the suburbs, it's always been something that I've not felt is completely outlandish to entertain. Some people who grew up in cities could never imagine doing such a thing, but for me, it seems a little bit more realistic. But it's tricky, right? The things that you love about living in a city are suddenly at risk or gone entirely. And it makes you question that, no doubt.
I mean, the fact that you can't gather in a large place like Mercedes-Benz Stadium is less than a mile from my home, and sporting events and concerts and all of the cultural and institutions and all the sports and all the it all requires gathering in close proximity to people. Transit, right? So I serve on the ATL board. We had a board meeting this morning talking about transit expansion in Atlanta and new MARTA routes and so forth. And the question about, I flew for the first time the other day from Atlanta to Nashville, and it's almost a coin toss as to whether fly or drive for that distance. But I wanted to fly to see what it was like. It's exceedingly weird. I don't know if either of you have done it, but it's just odd. But it feels good. It feels safe, and it's going to be okay again. I don't subscribe to the notion that there will be permanent life-altering effects from this pandemic. I believe that life will return to some semblance of normal. Will there be behavioral changes in all of us? Will we stay away from each other, and will we ever shake hands again? I don't know, but I still believe, and we've already seen it at Avalon. At Avalon we had 735,000 visitors in July of 19.
All right. Did we lose Mark?
I think Mark froze.
Mark is frozen. Yeah. So what I'm going to do actually is, in this case, is I'm just going to quickly throw to our first poll while we get Mark's connection back up and running.
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear if where everyone is joining us today from. So you'll see a question pop up on your screen here. Which category best describes you? So I just want to see what our audience makeup is today. I'm very curious. We've got lots of votes coming in. And while I do that, I want to ask a quick follow-up question. And Doug, this question will be for you. This question comes from Tina. And Tina says, regarding people leaving the city, do we think that the move would halt if things like decreased rental costs or increased salary and wages took place to encourage people to stay in cities? So a big issue right now is with the real estate market, that people can't afford to pay their rent. Now, I don't know if that is a problem that cities are dealing with, but surely because of higher rents, that would be a problem that would likely be a little more prevalent. So what's your feeling on that? Are there things that cities could be doing to encourage people to stay and to halt this mass, or not even mass exodus, as you said, but a slight exodus?
It's a good question. I guess from an employer standpoint, will employers work to try to keep people in proximity of cities? I'm not so sure. I think that major tech employers are probably looking at this as an opportunity to cut a lot of the capital that they have invested in office towers and leases and that sort of thing. Cities, that's a really good question. Would cities incentivize people to either stay, which could be done through property tax breaks? It could be done through rent controls, potentially. So that is an interesting point. But I think, another point here too is that, we look at this as being a one-way exodus. It is also conceivable that, you have millions upon millions of people who are also working in suburban markets, who may crave the city, may crave an urban lifestyle, but live in the suburbs because that happens to be where they work. So there could also be a little bit of a trade-off here as well. If people are freed to work from wherever they like, some people may choose to live a suburban life, given that freedom. Other people may choose to pursue a more rural or suburban life. So there could be a bit of a balancing, I guess, is what I'm saying. But it would certainly behoove cities to think now about how they can encourage retention of their residents, because it does have a multiplying impact when you lose high income wage earners from a city, that has a knock-on effect on the service industries in that city that is quite significant.
Great. Now I see Mark is back with us. So
Yeah,
thank
sorry,
you, Mark. I'm glad we got reconnected there. I'm just going to quickly share the poll results from poll one. And then Mark, I'll let you pick up where you left off. I also have another question for you, Mark, that we can get to that has, a lot to do with what we've spoken about. So in terms of our results, no real surprise here. Most of you are coming to us from the commercial real estate industry. And we've also got some brands and retailers and tech companies and consultants on with us today as well. So that's fantastic. Now, Mark, I'm going to, I'll let you pick up where you left off, but I'm also curious to hear a little bit more about something that Doug has often sort of referenced as being the moment I think he fell in love with your thinking on all things commercial real estate and retail. You've often said that you're not in the commercial real estate business, but rather in the entertainment and hospitality industry. I'd love to hear more of your ideas on what that means to you and how that informs your projects and the work that you do in all of your shopping centers.
Sure. So first, let me follow up first on Doug's thoughts on urban versus suburban. There is now an alternative, and that is the urban burb. So we developed one of about a dozen properties in the U.S. that are, we characterize as cities within cities, where you've got we have a full-time population at Avalon of about 1,200 people or so. And then there are hundreds of thousands that visit, there are tens of thousands that work there, and there are probably more than 100,000 that come to stay in the hotel or come to conferences. So for those who are seeking that urban experience, but live in but either live in the urban burb or live in the suburbs, they have the opportunity to work. And what we're seeing with employers specifically, in Midtown Atlanta, NCR, Google, Microsoft, and the other tech employers were chasing that tech employee who sought to live an urban lifestyle, and they wanted to locate their office near their employee base. Similarly, in Alpharetta, called the Technology City of the South, you've got a large cohort of probably older technology workers that live in that suburb, mostly for schools and other sort of lifestyle preferences. But as an example, Axis Insurance and Crown Castle and Microsoft, again, Microsoft with a full floor lease at 8,000 Avalon, have sought to put their employees in a workplace that has all of the pieces and parts of an urban lifestyle. So restaurants, retail, and entertainment, and experiences, which leads me to the entertainment and hospitality piece. So when we acquired Atlantic Station in 2010, one of the first movers out of the recession, we had these buildings that had spaces between the buildings that could be activated. And we brought on a general manager who managed two of the most iconic retail properties in the U.S. One, the Grove, it's in L.A., Rick Caruso property, and the other, Santana Row in San Jose by Federal Realty. Santana Row is mixed use. The Grove is all retail, but they both had similar pieces and parts. They had the opportunity to stage events and to welcome people onto the property and to create a relationship and do all the things that were very high touch. I was recruiting a restaurateur to Avalon that ended up being, it's called the restaurant called South City Kitchen that's at the hotel at Avalon. And I had a meeting scheduled in Cupertino at Apple and asked them to come along, and I wanted to show them Santana Row because Avalon had yet to be created, so nobody understood what it was going to be. And we walked into, we first went to LA, walked into we arrived by I guess it was Uber or taxi at the Grove, and we were walking around the property. We walk into the parking deck, and if you've been to the Grove or Americana brand or any Caruso property, you know that he's the king of hospitality in the retail environment. It's where we learned the craft. we unabashedly knock off whoever it is got the best idea. And we walked in with these two true hospitalitarians, right? And that phrase comes from Danny Meyer's book, Setting the Table. And they're both big Danny Meyer disciples. They've been in business 26 years in Atlanta. They have 12 or 15 restaurants. They're at the top of their game. We walk into the parking deck at the Grove, and they're looking around and said, "What hotel is this? This is not a hotel. This is the parking deck for this shopping center." And there's a shoe shine stand. There's a kiddie play area, and there's a concierge desk that is every bit as sumptuous as any five-star hotel you've ever seen. That began the process of us understanding, with Tom Miles, who joined us from Santana Row in the Grove, understanding the pieces and parts of hospitality, service, entertainment in retail. So we took Atlantic Station, which had the bricks and mortar, had the bones to be able to house these concepts, and we incubated all those concepts of lighting, music, valet, concierge, events, activation, social media, and started to build a community around, for the most part, events. So we hosted a series called Winter Wonder Jam during the winter of 2011 or 12. And we brought in big name free concerts. The idea there was to turn around a property that had been really beleaguered and mismanaged, and it was in a tailspin. So we invested very, very heavily in bringing the community onto the property, at the same time, leasing it, bringing on restaurateurs, boutique retailers, and started to redefine the experience. At that same time, we conceived of and we're beginning the planning process for Avalon. And we created spaces that were intended to be stages. Smaller spaces that for ad hoc little events, large stages that, as I mentioned earlier, during the pandemic, because we're not able to host large groups, we still have live music, but we just plug them into the PA system for the property, and the musicians play to an audience that's wandering around the property, in and out of the hotel and elsewhere. So entertainment and events, we host 200 plus events a year, everything from Tuesday mornings, we have an event called Little Acorns at Colony Square, which will be the next iteration of our model, an urban manifestation of Avalon. We have a helipad on one of the buildings. It's a 24-story building, and helipad's on the roof. So we host some very hot ticket events on the helipad, everything from wine tastings to barbecue contests to jazz festivals, all kinds of things. We take the opportunity to host our community on the property for free, to engage them and give them an opportunity to be together. That is what we've determined to be through observation, not through planning. This was not a great idea. This was just walking around the property and seeing people commune. We concluded that is our stock and trade. It's human energy and social interaction. And typically we foster that, or we invite those people on the property by hosting a significant event. So that's where we come to the entertainment piece.
I think for me, Mark, when you and I met, you invited me down. You were having an event at one of your homes for a group of partners and clients in the industry. And what the analogy I drew from one of our initial conversations is that, to me, the shopping center industry is not much different really than the circus industry, in the sense that circus would come to town, they'd pitch their tent, there was so little entertainment that people had, back in the day in the 30s and 40s that, like magic, people would flock to the tent to see the show. It didn't even really matter how great the show was. The fact that the circus was in town was enough to draw people. And to me, that was sort of the shopping center experience of the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, was that it was, the tent was pitched and you could go and see the show. But the thing about the commercial real estate industry for me was that everyone was talking about the tent. I would talk to developers and they'd be telling me how big the tent is and how many gross leasable square feet the tent has and how many tenants are in the tent. Nobody was talking about the show. You were talking about the show. You weren't, regaling people with how much square footage you had or how big or how tall or, all those sort of superlatives. It was about the show. And so for me, it's sort of the difference between Barnum and Bailey, which is the old version of circus, and Cirque du Soleil, where they took it to an entirely different level. And now all of a sudden circus became an art form, as opposed to just a sideshow sort of thing. So I think that's the fundamental difference, is that you focus on building the show while other companies tend to focus on pitching the tent.
I had not heard that analogy, but you're spot on. And I think one of the key components to that is the ability for us to shed the preconceived notions about what a shopping center needs to be, or what an office building or apartment community or whatever. And one critical ingredient to that is the people who operate them. So as an example, our Senior Vice President of Operations, Anil Express, came to us from the Four Seasons Hotel Company after a 15-year career as a hospitalitarian, right? Kaylee Mullen, who's our marketing director, came to us from Nordstrom. The general manager of Avalon today is a gentleman by the name of Paul Bodine, was a golf pro. And each of these individuals understood service and hospitality and guest experience. And it is a rare occurrence and when we first opened Avalon, we had hired a general manager who I will not name from Simon Properties, Simon Property Group, a mall manager. And that was her mindset. And that she thought she was running a mall. She didn't understand she was building community, that she was building relationships with individuals. There's a gentleman by the name of Jackson. I'll butcher his last name. I want to say it's Erivo. He's Haitian. And he came to us. My wife used to work at a gym called Exhale Spa. You may know it. It was in the Lowe's Hotel in Midtown. And we had visited the Grove in LA. And much like everything else we knock off, there's a guy named Coco at the Grove, who's the sort of lead valet. He doesn't actually park cars. He just opens doors and greets people. And he's in a classic Hollywood version of, he's a celebrity. And one day my wife, Nancy, came home and said, we have your Coco. And she said, I want you to come to the Lowe's Hotel. He was the lead doorman, valet there. And Jackson is now the face of Avalon. Jackson came to us not from parking cars, but from the hotel business. He's all about guest experience. Even there's a gentleman who has been with us in public safety at Avalon since the beginning. His name is Cham. He's West African. He can be a hard-nosed security guard, right? But more often than not, he's about assuring that our guests are having a good experience. And he's just this wonderfully warm, jolly, smiley-faced person. We're in the business of making people smile and feel something. We're not in the business of selling stuff. Are we going to sell stuff in the process? Absolutely. But it's almost a byproduct. It's almost an afterthought to the entertainment, the hospitality, and the service.
Now, I've got a ton of live questions coming through that I want to get through. We've got 15 minutes here, so I'm just going to jump right into them. We're talking a lot about experience, and I want to shift gears to the other side of things. We've got a few questions coming through about the alternative to retail. So we've been seeing this a lot, I know, in the news last year, as far as last year, Amazon buying up abandoned malls to use as warehouse centers and as fulfillment. Mark, you touched on this a little bit when we were chatting prior to the live stream. What I would like to know both of your thoughts on the idea of dark kitchens, micro fulfillment centers, and logistics. And this question comes from a few people, but this is Claire's verbiage here. Could that be a part of this alternative solution for these dying spaces if they're repurposed as service centers in whatever form that takes?
Doug, you want to take it
first? I'll take a stab. Yes, I think the simple answer is absolutely. The fact that, and we were talking about this a little bit in the green room before the event started, the fact of the matter is there are a lot of regional shopping centers that have lost their appeal, obviously, largely because they're sort of the culmination of a lot of brands that frankly have lost their relevance. Mostly apparel brands in a lot of these regional shopping centers. But that does not negate the value of that real estate being in proximity to markets that matter. And so certainly, if we see the kind of persistent increase in e-commerce that we are seeing now, with Amazon, literally doubling its volume in a short period of time, then yeah, absolutely, those centers become potentially great dark stores or fulfillment warehouses, micro warehouses in proximity to customers. And that has a huge potential impact on last mile delivery costs if you now have these logistics centers in proximity to these markets. So I think that that's certainly a transition that we're already starting to see the discussions around these sorts of things taking place. And I think it will certainly be a part of the equation going forward. Mark, what do you think?
No question. I think that especially the B and C malls where their regional location lends itself to fulfillment and last mile e-commerce solutions, that is attractive. I think that to the extent that those buildings, those malls have other uses, whether they be institutional or healthcare or houses of worship or other uses that require large fields of parking. One thing that I would caution about and that concerns me that I see going on, I actually haven't seen it deployed in person, in bricks and mortar yet, but I've seen it lots of planning and discussion about adding components to malls in order to diversify the use. So, as an example, North Point Mall in Alpharetta, which is near Avalon, has proposed that they take the Sears box, which is dark, tear it down and build an apartment community and some outdoor retail space. There's a phrase for that. I didn't coin the phrase. It's called Frankensteining. Right? So you're taking a dead box, lopping it off, plugging in an apartment building and saying everything's going to be okay. Everything's not going to be okay. There may be some who want to live at the mall, but for the most part, that apartment community could have been anywhere, and it's not really bringing anything to the mall. The mall's not bringing anything to the apartment community. The great thing about mixed use, properly deployed, is that the uses are complementary and symbiotic, right? The opportunity to truly transform the site on which the mall resides requires wholesale demolition of the mall. We acquired a property in Midtown Atlanta called Colony Square. It's 850,000 square feet of office space. It's 460 condominiums, 500-room hotel, W hotel, and a 250,000 square foot mall. The only way to resolve it was to demolish it to the ground and rebuild it, which we're in the final stages of doing right now. And in doing so, create that third place for the total community. It's not about shopping. Is there shopping? Well, there's shopping and dining and entertainment being done there? Yes. But it's about providing, it's interesting, the analog to Apple's town square notion that, today at Apple, they bring people into the store and teach them something. It could be art on an iPad, or it could be, typically it's Apple related. But the whole notion of providing that town square, it dates all the way back to the European cities. Every neighborhood in every European city has a little square that's ringed with restaurants and bars. And that's where people go to be. You can't do that in a regional mall if you just lop off a box and put a fulfillment center, an apartment building, or a hotel.
So true. And I was researching that Today at Apple program to see the success of it. And something I found really interesting were that flagship stores in various parts of the world are actually having, Apple stores in particular, are having to be redesigned to facilitate the number of people that they have coming in to take part in these programs. Right. So it's an interesting contrast when you look at the majority of retailers that we speak to are struggling to understand how to get people in the store. Whereas you've got Apple that's created this program that's so lucrative to their customers and means so much to their customers, they're having to redesign stores to facilitate the number of people that want to come in. So I think those are really interesting parallels. And Mark, you started to touch on this whole idea of this Frankensteining. And I think it's going to become a really important issue for a lot of people in commercial real estate who are now struggling to understand when these anchor tenants go out of business, what to do with those spaces. And we have a few questions related to this as well from our audience today that ask about, what the impact of these spaces are going to be. So where do you see the balance coming into play when we see major retailers now leaving shopping centers? What's your answer to that? Is it more entertainment, hospitality? Is it food and beverage? What does the balance look like in the future of these retail spaces? Well,
currently in the pandemic, some of the most hard hit aspects of our tenancy is food and beverage and entertainment, because of the requirements that you gather people in a small space indoors. That will pass, and also the pressure. I mean, there are so many pressures, whether it's the pandemic or e-commerce or just general malaise in retailing, whether it be bricks and mortar or other. The film industry is in a tremendous upheaval with delivery of film, and the deal that AMC just made with one of the studios about releasing films 17 days after to live streaming. That all of those pressures are going to yield something. But the one thing that, relative to department stores specifically, is that the silver lining in the demise of the American department store, which is well underway. I mean, Sears, JCPenney, Macy's, they're going away. Not all of them, not everywhere, but there are lots of department stores that are currently either operating or dark in regional malls that have significant approval and control rights over that regional mall. In 1993, we demalled a property in Orlando called Colonial Plaza, which had been eclipsed by a mall on Colonial Boulevard called Fashion Square. Now that mall, Fashion Square, has been eclipsed yet again. But at that time, there was Dillard's, Belk, there was another anchor, and we were able to get control of those boxes, or the redevelopment of that mall would have been absolutely impossible. That situation exists in every mall in America. So the demise of the department store will actually it will hasten the opportunity to redevelop malls. So I view that as a net positive, notwithstanding the challenges that the department stores face.
I think it comes down to, for me, it's a pretty simple equation. I think people are going to go to places to get things that they can't get at home. pure and simple.
Mhm.
And so if you, if you can, through other means, if you can acquire a product that you're looking for, unless there's some other experience that's attached to the purchase of that product, why would you bother? So, I think that ultimately people are going to get in their car and go to a place that has merchants that offer a pleasant experience, time well spent while buying their products. And they will go there for things that they can't get at home, which might just be as simple as a beer and a hot dog and listening to music,
Mhm.
but I think that's really the key, the crux of the whole shopping center question is one of access. And the shopping center in its day was really the analog version of the internet. When I was growing up, the shopping center was Facebook. It's where you went to meet up with friends. It was Uber Eats because they had a food court. It was Amazon because that's where all the brands and all the products
Mhm.
were. And the mall was really your only access to those things. In some cases, the mall was the only place that had a movie theater in town.
Mhm.
So here we are, 40, 50 years later, and none of that is true anymore. The fact is we have access to whatever we want, whenever we want it. And so that the challenge, I guess, for Mark and his team and other people in the industry is to answer that, unlock that question. So what is it that people can't get at home? And Mark has said it many times. What they can't get at home is the human energy of a community.
Mhm.
That can bring them for a multitude of reasons, but the least of which is probably in the long term going to be going to get a new pair of running shoes, or
Right.
to buy a product. It's going to be more complex than that, and I think that's what's challenging the industry right now.
All right, so we've got 4 minutes left. I want to launch our second poll and our final poll. As a consumer, do you want to see more or less mixed use commercial space? So I'm just curious to get everyone's feeling on what they prefer in their own personal lives as consumers. And while I do that, I'd ask both of you, I'm curious to hear your sort of one final thought to our audience today. Now, Mark, there was a specific question that was a follow-up that you might want to consider incorporating in your answer, which is, knowing this, what do you consider to be the new 21st century anchor tenant? If those department stores do go away, in your mind, what does the future of your spaces and commercial real estate look like? And Doug, I would love your thoughts on that as well in 3 minutes or less for both of you.
So I don't believe an anchor tenant in the classic sense of a department store will return. We believe that the commercial district in a mixed-use property is the anchor tenant for that district. So the community is drawn to the commerce, right? So that energy that's created in the patio seating at the restaurants and the shops and the service providers and maybe the movie theater, the grocery store, or whatever, that is the anchor. And whatever it is, the funny thing is that the thing that draws people is people. And whatever it is that draws people, that is our anchor. And in our case, in the large scale mixed use business, it is the commercial district, the main street.
Yeah, I would say I agree with Mark's comment, and I would say that it really is about this notion of staging experiences, and looking at it through that lens. That every single thing in that center matters. Who you hire to be that concierge or be the face of the space, the curation and adjacencies of really interesting and sometimes risky tenancies that you have to take some gambles, and take some bets on things, and then really just looking at the moments within that journey that the consumer is going through, and really breaking it down into the smallest micro moments and designing those, not just leaving them to chance. I think that most property managers, most shopping center companies really don't have much of a clue what people do once they cross the threshold. They may have some vague metrics that they're looking at, some vague data that they're looking at, but they haven't designed every single moment of that consumer's experience. And I really think that that's the granularity, the level of granularity that you have to go to really deliver something that is meaningful and sustainable in this environment. And it will be a challenge going forward, but I think Mark and his team and other visionary teams out there are proving that yes, there is a place for these communal spaces. We just have to redefine what those look like and what they feel like. Yeah, and I think if we can do that, then we're going to have, again, a healthier industry coming out of this.
Well, the good news is the majority of our audience wants more mixed-use commercial space.
That's great.
That's fantastic news for everyone involved in our live stream today. And that concludes our stream for today. So I wanted to thank everyone for joining us. I know we couldn't get to nearly all of your questions, but we'll do our best to follow up on social media after. You can use the hashtag #RetailProfitAMA, and we'll be getting to all of your questions as a follow-up. I want to thank Mark so much for spending an hour with us today and for his wisdom and creativity. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you all next time.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Mark.
We'll see you again. See you soon, Doug.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Bye-bye.